Today, I'll be answering the web's most searched questions about nuclear energy. From its renewability, to its safety concerns, to how long it can last us, let's get into all of the myths about nuclear energy and see, is it good, is it bad, is it somewhere in between? We're going to be doing bite-sized information about each of these different questions, so if you want a full video on any of these topics, definitely let me know. Hello everyone, it's Emma, and welcome back to my channel where I talk about all sorts of things at zero waste, focusing on free, easy, and fun ways to live low waste, and practical ways that we can all be activists. If I talk a little bit too fast, there is a gear icon that you can use right down here to change the speed of the video. Honestly, this was inspired by this video where I reacted to a climate denier who was going on and on and on about how environmentalists hate nuclear, and I'm like, I just don't think that's the case. So I want to look into the facts of nuclear, draw my own conclusions about if I think it is good or bad. I will let you know at the end, but for now, let's get into the facts. Formulate your own opinions based off of the facts. You can find all the sources linked down below in my blog post. And I've got a lot of questions, so let's just get right into it. How long has nuclear energy existed? So nuclear energy has been part of the global energy grid since the 1950s. And it really had its peak heyday in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Popularity over the years has risen and fallen due to different controversies, disasters, etc., etc. And of course, before nuclear energy came the nuclear bomb, which still exists and play a major role in modern war, tactics, politics, and so much more to this day. So research into nuclear fission, which is the same thing that we get bombs and energy for, nuclear fission does both, began just before World War II, really ramped up during World War II, of course, and was the creation of the first two atomic bombs that were dropped on civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are two very important Japanese cities that were impacted during World War II and are still facing the horrors to this day and are big proponents of becoming denuclearized worldwide. Now, Japan still uses nuclear energy, so they're not entirely against nuclear energy, but they are big proponents of being anti-nuclear weapons. And we'll talk more about weapons later on. Okay, next question. How does nuclear energy work? So it's using uranium-235 or U-235 from here on out, and this is one of the isotopes that does fission the most easily. Let's get into the science of it, shall we? During fission, U-235 atoms absorb loose neutrons. This causes U-235 to become unstable and split into two light atoms called fission products. The combined mass of the fission products is less than that of the original U-235. This reduction occurs because some of the matter changes into energy. The energy is released as heat. 2 or 3 neutrons are released along with the heat. These neutrons may hit other atoms, causing more fission. So when all of these neutrons and balls of energy are bouncing off of one another, this creates a chain reaction of nuclear fission. So if enough uranium is brought together under the right conditions, a continuous chain reaction can just keep occurring and can actually become self-sustaining. A self-sustaining chain reaction causes a really big amount of heat. This heat can be used to generate electricity. In fact, this is always how we get electricity when steam is involved. That's usually the burning of coal, oil, and gas. So water is heated, the steam rises, it turns turbines and fans and engines, and that's what generates the electricity, is the heat. So the main difference here is just the source of the heat. Is the source of the heat burning coal, or is it nuclear fission? Okay, next one. How long will nuclear energy last? Before researching for this video, I thought we had a solid 80 years left. I think that was just pretty common knowledge in the eco space and in the energy space, and that did used to be the case. But there have been a lot of new technologies in the last few decades to help us maybe have nuclear for the rest of time. And now we have new technologies like breeder reactors, which I think needs a little bit rebranding. I think the name's a little weird, but the name does make sense. A breeder reactor is a nuclear reactor that generates more fissile material than it consumes. These reactors can be fueled with more commonly available isotopes of uranium or thorium, such as uranium-238 and thorium-232, as opposed to the very rare uranium-235, which is using conventional reactors that we discussed before. These materials are called fertile materials since they can be bred into fuel by these breeder reactors. Interest declined in these in the 1960s as more uranium reserves were found and new methods of uranium enrichment reduced fuel costs. So yes, breeder reactors can cost billions, with a B, dollars to build, as well as we're really operating with the same technology from the 1980s with breeder reactors because of their unpopularity and because of the increased access of U-235. So I think there is a future here, but we just need some more research and development to make this more cost effective, cost less, and to prove that this is necessary and valuable if we are to have a future with nuclear energy. But of course, as for the reactor itself, it is not eternal. The Department of Energy estimates that each facility has about a 20 to 80 year lifespan depending on how well it's built, as well as maintenance. So even if a facility is in tip-top shape, it'll still only last about 80 years. Okay, last one over here. How is the storage of nuclear energy waste a problem? Because it is a problem. When you think of nuclear energy, you probably think of radioactive waste, right? That is precisely what we're talking about here with spent fuel. So the specific type of nuclear waste is stored in special facilities to allow the radioactivity and pollution to decay, and that way it's safer to handle in years to come, but it does take a while for it to decay. So storage of nuclear waste may be done in ponds or concrete casks or even underground. In the US, the Department of Energy is responsible for disposing of this high-level waste in a permanent geologic repository, but it has yet to build such a facility because policymakers have been at an impasse over what to do with the spent fuel since 2010. As a result, the amount of spent nuclear fuel stored at nuclear power plants across the country continues to grow by about 2,000 metric tons per year. All this time, the federal government has paid billions of dollars in damages to nuclear facilities to prevent this radioactive waste from leaking out into the environment. And they may even pay tens of billions of dollars more in the coming decades unless we get these storage facilities under control and in the process of being built. Especially as natural disasters increase as man-made climate change becomes more and more of a problem, this is a huge concern, rightfully so, as hurricanes become more frequent and stronger, flooding becomes a problem, as Tornado Alley shifts and tornadoes become more common. There are many reasons why we should be worried about nuclear reactors and spent fuel when it comes to natural disasters. And keep in mind, this is just for nuclear energy. We are not going to be talking about the waste that comes with nuclear weapons, but that is something to be concerned about as well. Alright, let's move on to our next set of questions. Is nuclear energy renewable? No, technically not, because once we harvest that uranium from the ground, it will no longer be replenished. So while these materials are currently available in high quantity, they are not renewable in the same way that the sun shines and the wind blows. But of course, as we discussed above, there are ways to make nuclear energy more efficient and technically last as long as possible due to special chain reactions and things. But no, uranium itself, U-235, will run out eventually. This really depends on how popular nuclear energy becomes, how popular breeder facilities become, but researchers estimate that we have about 80 to 200 years left of U-235. A question that I actually get asked a lot, which I did not think was a very common question, is nuclear energy a fossil fuel? No. So nuclear energy is created by the fission of nuclear atoms, which produces heat. Of course, when we burn coal, oil, and gas, we still get heat to warm water to give us energy. So it is a very similar process. So nuclear energy is also uranium, U-235 to be specific, and fossil fuels are also non-renewable energy that is formed from the buried remains of ancient plants and animals over millions of years. And the other difference is fossil fuels are burned while nuclear energy uses nuclear fission. Okay, the question you've all been waiting for. Is nuclear energy safe? You've probably heard of the famous disasters of Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island. And that might put this idea into your head, as it did mine for a bit, that there's no way that nuclear energy can be safe. While the fallout from these accidents is extreme, it is also very rare. Yes, I'm still worried about this myself, but let's look at the evidence. In the 60-year history of civil nuclear power generation, with over 18,500 cumulative reactor years across 36 countries, there have only been 3 significant accidents at nuclear power plants. 3 Mile Island in the US, the reactor was damaged but radiation was contained. Chernobyl in the Ukrainian Soviet Union was a steam explosion and fire that caused a radiation leak that killed 30 people and created adverse health and environmental impacts. And Fukushima in Japan in 2011, 3 reactors were shut down due to tsunami damage and were inadequately contained, but there was no loss of life due to radiation. Since its creation, scientists have been working hard to ensure public safety. Their main concern early on was preventing nuclear meltdown. A nuclear meltdown is a severe nuclear reactor accident that occurs when a reactor's core overheats, causing the fuel to melt and potentially releasing large amounts of radiation. This is an absolutely worst case scenario for nuclear energy, and it ultimately happens when the cooling system fails or is otherwise defective, resulting in a loss of coolant. But let's look on the flip side. Since it doesn't produce any CO2, it's actually safer for us because it doesn't produce any air pollution. Fossil fuels create smog, which can lead to asthma and other upper respiratory issues. It can also pollute water, pollute soil, and do so much more damage. We see these very few nuclear accidents and write off all of nuclear energy as a potential energy source. Meanwhile, fossil fuels are literally killing us every single day. We see the adverse effects of fossil fuels like climate change, asthma, cancer, and we turn a blind eye. I'm not here to say that nuclear energy is perfect, but we do need to look at the facts that fossil fuels are also dangerous, and we do need to move to something safer. Is nuclear energy expensive? Yeah, unfortunately, this is the category that it does not win in. Currently, fossil fuels are the cheapest, but that is mostly due to subsidies and lack of carbon tax. If a carbon tax were implemented to curb emissions and pollution, then this would make nuclear energy more competitive. Nuclear power plants are extremely expensive to build, but relatively cheap to operate once they're built. And in many places across the world and in the US, nuclear energy is very competitive price-wise to fossil fuels, as well as very competitive in terms of energy generation. Waste disposal and decommissioning costs of power plants are usually fully included in operating costs. And as we discussed before, the social, the health, and environmental costs of fossil fuels need to be weighed into this conversation. And that greatly helps increase the competitiveness of nuclear energy. This chart from Ontario, Canada shows that nuclear energy is just barely more expensive than hydroelectricity, but far outcompetes wind, solar, and natural gas. I also like to see when other forms of green energy are compared to nuclear energy to show how competitive it can be. Next question. Is nuclear energy better than other forms of green energy? Well, let's bring it back to that chart from Canada. Nuclear energy is one of the leaders and cheapest forms of green energy. But what about energy production? How much energy can nuclear power plants produce? Well, it way outcompetes other forms of green energy in this area. Not only does it outcompete other forms of green energy, it's also outcompeting fossil fuels in terms of energy production. And this is incredible news because climate dismissives way often say that we can't move to green energy, our grid just can't handle it, we consume too much energy and we don't produce enough, and therefore the grid would just crash. Well, if the grid doesn't crash on coal, the grid surely won't crash on a more efficient nuclear energy grid. Alright, let's swap out our signs. First on this list is... what makes nuclear energy so much better? Well, in comparison to fossil fuels, they require much less maintenance. And it can also operate much longer than fossil fuel plants without refueling it. So this is really how nuclear energy outcompetes fossil fuels. Not to mention, other forms of renewables just aren't as competitive due to natural factors. The sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing, so these forms of energy cannot operate 24/7. Of course, solar panels are going to be placed in a sunny environment like the desert, but even there you might get a rare cloudy day. But with nuclear, uranium can always go through fission no matter the weather, no matter the location it's placed on Earth, therefore making it the most fuel efficient and highest producer of energy. But of course, another concern with nuclear energy, what are the vulnerabilities, oh my gosh, of nuclear energy? Of course, the safety of power plants has always been a big concern, but even more so in the US after 9/11. 9/11 had huge impacts across the US in terms of green energy, climate change, going green, etc., and I plan on making a full video on that in September. If you guys are interested, I am like really hyperfixated on this right now, on how 9/11 not only shaped global politics, but also global climate policy, so let me know if you're interested in seeing more on that. Now, why would nuclear energy be under threat after 9/11? Because they are a site for potential terrorist attacks, and potential site for just war planning in general, as we saw with the US targeting these in Iran. Which is funny, right? That if someone were to attack our nuclear power plant, it would be called a terrorist attack. When the US does it to somebody else, it's defense. Interesting. That's a topic for another day. So to combat this threat of terrorist attacks in the US, protective measures have been put in place such as barriers, fences, key cards to access entry, special accesses, permissions, security clearances, and things like that. But cyber attacks are also of a huge concern. There is concern of an entity hacking the computer system of power plants from the inside. Other downsides include that we already talked about, like long-lived waste product that can be harmful for literally decades, as well as expensive costs to start a power plant, and high costs to decommission them too. Of course, there's also risks of accidents, risks of meltdowns. There are a lot of risks to nuclear energy that shouldn't be ignored. But there are barriers in place to prevent every single one of those vulnerabilities. Moving on, what is the carbon footprint of nuclear energy? Another area where it really wins. Globally, the energy sector continues to be the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, contributing to about 40% and rising. So is nuclear a worthy substitute to stop climate change? Of course, nuclear energy is still responsible for some greenhouse gas emissions. There is not a single thing on the planet that is man-made that has zero carbon footprint. Of course, it is all far less than fossil fuels, but none of them are zero. So when it comes to nuclear, the extraction of uranium contributes to fossil fuel usage, transport and processing results in emissions. The very long and complex process of building these gigantic nuclear power plants requires a lot of concrete and tools, fuel to operate the machinery, and also the demolition and decommission of the power plants once they die. And last but not least, in this category of nuclear emissions comes with transporting the spent fuel to a safe location for it to decay. So all these different steps in the process do create some fossil fuels for now. Of course, if we move into a greener future and our construction materials are made more sustainably and our construction vehicles are operated off of green energy, the carbon footprint will go down drastically for nuclear energy as we move to a more green grid. But as it stands right now, in a fossil fuel run country and world, we're going to be using fossil fuels to create green energy. But that is simply for the mining and the creation of all of these products. You could say the same thing for oil rigs, the same thing for solar panels, the same thing for wind turbines. So what is the carbon footprint of making energy? The Netherlands-based World Information Service on Energy, WISE, calculated that nuclear power plants produce 117 grams of CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour. How does this compare? It's about in the middle of all different forms of energy. It far outcompetes fossil fuels, but there are other forms of renewable energy that do create fewer emissions when operating and also to build all of the facilities. Next up, what is the land use of nuclear energy? This is also a really big argument against green energy across all different forms. Keep in mind, fossil fuels also use a ton of land, so this argument is basically null, especially if you're using this as your only reason to be anti-green energy. But how much land use does nuclear energy take up? Well, wind farms require about 360 times as much land area to produce the same amount of electricity as a nuclear energy facility. This is based off of a Nuclear Energy Institute analysis. Solar facilities require up to 75 times the land area of nuclear, and this this is especially an important factor here since, remember, nuclear energy is so efficient. In order to produce the same amount of electricity with any other form of energy would require huge amounts of land because nuclear is so good at making so much. A nuclear energy facility has a small area footprint, requiring about 1.3 square miles per 1,000 megawatts of installed capacity. This figure is based off of the median land area of the 59 nuclear plant sites in the US. Taking these factors into account, a wind farm would need an installed capacity between 1,900 megawatts and 2,800 megawatts to generate the same amount of electricity in a year as a 1,000 megawatt nuclear energy facility. So nuclear is 2 to 3 times more efficient than wind. Such a wind facility would require between 260 square miles and 360 square miles of land. And what about solar? It must have an installed capacity of 3,300 megawatts and 5,400 megawatts to match a 1,000 megawatt nuclear facility, meaning that nuclear is more efficient than solar by 3 to 5 times. A solar facility of this capacity would require 45 to 75 square miles. Again, nuclear would only require 1.3 square miles, so it is easily the most land efficient. If you are anti-green energy because of land use, you should be pro-nuclear for this reason. Thank you to my assistant, aka me. Can nuclear energy be used for nuclear weapons? In short, yes, because as we discussed early on, it is the same technology. It is the same concept of nuclear fission that creates a nuclear bomb, that creates a nuclear power plant. In other words, if countries have the ability to extract uranium, turn it into stuff, do the fission, make the facilities, they can technically create nuclear bombs as well. Now, I personally don't think that this is a reason to ban nuclear energy because I think there are just so many pros to nuclear energy, but also as someone who is very anti-nuclear weaponry, this is frightening. Now, what I really don't think should be happening here is the US being the body of who gets to decide who has nuclear weapons and who doesn't. That country over there, because the US doesn't like them, they can't have nuclear weapons. Of course, I wish 0 countries had nuclear weapons. I wish the entire world would denuclearize their militaries. So I do think that we need stricter global rules when it comes to nuclear weapon proliferation, but without hindering nuclear energy, because I think nuclear energy does have its place when it comes to a greener future. This is very nuanced, and we can talk about this more in depth another day, but those are my thoughts right now based off of the facts. And our last question is, can nuclear energy be safer than fossil fuels? Of course, every form of energy has its downsides. Every form of energy is going to impact humans in some way or another. But there are 3 main ways. One is air pollution. Millions of people die prematurely every single year due to fossil fuels. Well, technically it's from air pollution, but where do we get air pollution? Fossil fuels, and also the burning of biomass like a campfire. Number 2 reason how energy affects humans is accidents. This includes accidents like mining and extraction of fossil fuels, the extraction of rare minerals and uranium, accidents transporting the raw materials, accidents refining the raw materials, constructing the power plants, maintenance, operating the power plants. There are so many ways that humans can be involved and potentially involved in accidents. And the third impact of energy on humans is emissions. Fossil fuels are the main source of greenhouse gas and therefore the leading cause of climate change. In 2020, this stat is shocking. 91% of emissions were linked to fossil fuels. I love this chart from Our World and Data, where it shows that nuclear energy is not only the cleanest, but also one of the safest in terms of accidents and emissions. It comes only second in safety to solar energy, and it is barely safer than wind. So, what are my personal thoughts on nuclear energy? I think that I really discounted it in the past. Of course, I think we should be wary about nuclear meltdown. We should be wary about accidents and natural disasters, especially as climate change gets worse. We should be wary about spent fuel, and we should be worried about nuclear weapons. But honestly, I think there's just such a divide between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy that I think we can just focus on the energy here. We really cannot ignore, though, that factually it is one of the safest. Factually, it is the most effective, the most efficient form of energy production across all forms of energy, way outcompeting fossil fuels. It uses the least amount of land compared to any other form of fuel. And if we really invest into research and development of breeder reactors, we can have nuclear energy potentially for forever. I think this is especially important because, yeah, currently as it sits, we consume way too much. We consume way too much energy. We consume way too many goods. So if we want to maintain our current level of consumption, we can't just go to solar and wind because they truly cannot stand our current level of consumption. We do need something that will compete with fossil fuels, and that is nuclear. So if you are still wary about nuclear after all these facts and you would rather switch to solar or wind or other form of green energy, you're really gonna have to start consuming less and encouraging everyone else to get on board, which probably won't happen. So yes, I am still very pro solar and wind, especially because they are truly renewable, and of course they require a lot less emissions to create those facilities than nuclear energy. But I think if we need something to bridge the gap between fossil fuels and solar and wind, nuclear is a great chance to bridge that gap. It is a great chance for us to migrate to a more effective and efficient solar and wind grid without having to stop our consumption habits. And even if we never invest time and research into breeder reactors, we still have 80 to 200 years of nuclear energy using U-235, which is plenty of time to work on amplifying and getting ready our solar and wind grids. So that is all that I have for now about nuclear energy. Let me know your thoughts down below. Now that you have been presented with the facts, again, all of my sources are on the blog post down below. And if you have more questions about nuclear energy, please leave them down below as well. I would love to make a part 2. I thought this would be a little bit boring, not gonna lie. I really just made this video to prove a hater wrong, and I had so much fun researching it, making my little boards out of fully recycled materials, a little bit behind the scenes how I made these, and getting creative with the presentation of the information in this video. So I hope that you enjoyed this format. It was very, very fun for me. Hopefully it was fun for you as well, and hopefully you learned something. And now maybe there are more of us who are truly pro-nuclear now. Again, let us know your thoughts below. I will see you in the next video, but until then, remember that your small actions make a big difference in the long run. Bye, guys. Well, I always hit record. I'm never ready. There's ginger beer. Non-alcoholic. I just have a tummy ache. Once again, not ready though. To be honest, I was really scared that was going to rip off my paint. Oh, that made me really nervous. If we do want a future with nuclear energy, and to prove that this is tornadoes and I almost said alligator alley. And fossil fuels are, what is a fossil fuel? All right, next up is, oop, my piece of tape stuck to nuclear weapon proliferation. Literally about to do my one last question. Yeah, I need this. Thank you. It's so nice. Prop it up so she can't sit on it again. Here, you can sit on this one. I'm done with this one. Let the record show I am removing the tape from these strips of paper, and I will save these strips of paper for something.